You have suffered a defeat. Perhaps you are suffering it still. I do not know its particular shape, whether it came in the form of professional ruin, or the collapse of a cherished relationship, or the public exposure of some failure you had hoped to keep hidden. I do not know whether it struck suddenly, like lightning from a clear sky, or gathered slowly, like storm clouds you watched approach but could not escape. What I know is this: you believe, in some chamber of your heart where honesty still dwells, that this defeat has diminished you, that you are less than you were before it fell upon you, that others who have not suffered such reverses are somehow more whole, more worthy, more likely to achieve what you once hoped to achieve. There exists in the drawing rooms and boardrooms of every civilized nation a conspiracy so complete, so thoroughly maintained, that most people pass through their entire lives without ever suspecting its existence. It is not a conspiracy of malice. Indeed, its perpetrators are often unaware of their own participation. It is not enforced by threat or punishment, yet it binds the successful as surely as any oath sworn in blood. I speak of the great conspiracy of silence that surrounds the subject of defeat. I have sat at dinner tables with captains of industry, with generals who commanded armies, with statesmen who shaped the destinies of nations. I have observed how they speak of their triumphs, freely, expansively, with that comfortable satisfaction that achievement bestows. Yet watch their faces when the conversation turns toward early failures, toward the catastrophes that preceded their rise. A curious thing occurs. Eyes shift, subjects change. The past is rewritten in real time, edited of its darker chapters, presented as a smooth ascent from promise to fulfillment. I recall with particular vividness an evening at a great house where 7 men of considerable accomplishment had gathered. By some accident of atmosphere, perhaps the brandy, perhaps the lateness of the hour, the conversation turned to early disasters. What followed astonished me, though I ought not to have been surprised. Within the space of an hour, each man had confessed to catastrophes he had never before discussed in company: bankruptcy, public humiliation, dismissal from positions they had thought secure, betrayals that had left them questioning their judgment of character. One by one, the masks came down. The shock was not the stories themselves. I had suspected that such stories existed behind most accomplished facades. The shock was the realization that dawned upon each face as the confessions accumulated. Every man in that room had believed himself uniquely marked by failure. Every man had assumed that his colleagues had glided from strength to strength, whilst he alone had stumbled and fallen. Every man had been both victim and perpetrator of the great conspiracy, hiding his own defeats whilst believing himself surrounded by the undefeated. Consider the damage this conspiracy inflicts. The young officer who suffers his first reverse believes he has revealed himself as unfit for command, when in truth he has merely joined the vast company of officers who have known defeat and risen from it. The businessman whose first venture fails concludes that commerce is not his calling, when every titan of industry could tell him tales of collapsed enterprises that preceded their eventual success. The politician who loses an election retreats from public life, convinced that the voters have rendered final verdict upon his worth, when the annals of history overflow with great leaders who suffered crushing defeats before achieving what they achieved. The conspiracy creates a grotesque distortion of reality. Success is performed publicly. Defeat is endured privately. We compare our complete experience, including our failures, our humiliations, our moments of despair, to the curated presentations of others. We see only their triumphs and conclude that we alone have known the taste of ashes. This comparison, systematically false, produces a systematically false conclusion, that our defeats mark us as different from the successful, when in truth our defeats mark us as exactly like them. I put to you a test that will prove the conspiracy's existence. Select any 10 figures whose success you admire: statesmen, generals, men of letters, captains of industry. Research not their achievements, but their disasters. In every case, without exception, you will discover chapters of catastrophe that the public narrative has quietly erased. The bankruptcy that preceded the fortune, the electoral humiliation that preceded the premiership, the military disaster that preceded the victory that made them famous. The evidence is overwhelming once you look for it, yet we persist in not looking. Why do we not look? Because we are complicit. Every time we present only our successes to the world, we perpetuate the lie that damages others. Every time we accept the edited version of another's history, we reinforce the conspiracy that imprisons us all. We are not merely victims of this deception, we are its active agents, maintaining by our daily conduct the very falsehood that constrains us. There is a further proof of the conspiracy's falseness, and it is this. If successful people had truly never been defeated, you would meet former successful people everywhere, those destroyed by their first encounter with catastrophe, those who proved unable to rise after falling. That you do not meet such legions is evidence that they learned to survive what you have been taught would destroy them. The defeated who became successful did not cease to exist. They merely ceased to speak of their defeats. They joined the conspiracy. What, then, shall we do with this recognition? First, we must cease to feel uniquely marked by our failures. The isolation that defeat creates, the terrible sense that one has fallen whilst others float, dissolves in the understanding that falling is universal. Your defeat does not separate you from the company of the successful. It initiates you into their ranks, for they have all passed through the same fires that now burn you. Second, we must begin to break the conspiracy by strategic honesty. I do not advocate theatrical confession or the public display of wounds for sympathy's sake. I advocate appropriate acknowledgment, particularly to the young, to those just beginning their ventures, that our paths included valleys as well as peaks. When a young officer looks to you for guidance, do not pretend you never erred. When a rising businessman seeks your counsel, do not conceal the enterprises that collapsed before you found your footing. Such honesty costs little and provides much. The conspiracy has endured because it serves the vanity of those who maintain it. It is pleasant to be thought naturally victorious, to appear as one who has glided effortlessly to prominence. But this pleasant vanity is purchased at terrible cost, the cost borne by those who believe the lie and conclude that their own defeats disqualify them from the success they might otherwise achieve. Let us have done with pleasant lies. Let us acknowledge the truth that every genuine accomplishment emerges from the ashes of genuine failure, and let us begin to ask the question that this recognition demands. If defeat does not disqualify us from success, what is defeat actually for? What does it provide that success cannot? These questions shall occupy us in the chapters that follow. From the nursery to the university, from the family hearth to the public square, we are subjected to an education so thorough in its effects that most never recognize it as education at all. It operates not through explicit instruction but through accumulated impression, not through lessons formally taught but through responses consistently rewarded and punished. I speak of the systematic training that teaches us to interpret defeat as verdict rather than as education. Observe the schoolboy who fails his examination. What does he learn from this experience? Not, in most cases, curiosity about the gaps in his understanding, not interest in the particular confusions that led to incorrect answers. He learns shame. He learns that failure is something to be hidden, explained away, overcome as quickly as possible so that the unpleasant episode might be forgotten. The red mark on his paper is not an invitation to investigation. It is a brand of inadequacy. This training deepens as the years pass. The young professional who fails at a project learns not to examine the failure, but to distance himself from it. He constructs explanations that minimize his role. He hopes the matter will be forgotten. If he is fortunate enough to succeed subsequently, he erases the failure from his personal narrative, speaking only of his triumphs. A lesson has been learned. Failure is not information to be studied, but evidence to be buried. I observed a young officer of great promise who suffered a reverse in a minor engagement. No lives were lost, merely an objective was not achieved. His superior, meaning well, told him to put it behind him, not to dwell on failure, to look forward rather than backward. Within 6 months, this officer had become cautious to the point of uselessness. He could not make any decision that carried risk of failure, for he had learned that failure was something shameful, something not to be examined but avoided at any cost. Contrast him with another officer who, after a more serious setback, was told by his superior to study that defeat until he knew it better than his own face. This officer spent weeks examining what had gone wrong, not to punish himself but to understand. He identified the precise moment when his judgment had erred. He traced the error to its source in his own assumptions. He emerged from this investigation with a kind of knowledge that no success could ever have provided. That officer became one of the finest tactical minds I have encountered. The difference between these two officers was not native ability. Both possessed talent in abundance. The difference was in how they were taught to receive defeat. One learned to flee from it, the other learned to study it. One emerged crippled by an experience that should have strengthened him. The other emerged strengthened by an experience that might have crippled him. Where does this crippling education originate? I identify 3 primary sources, though others exist. First, schools that reward correct answers whilst punishing wrong ones, teaching students that errors are evidence of inadequacy rather than opportunities for learning. Second, families that withdraw approval after failure, training children to associate defeat with loss of love. Third, early professional environments that treat mistakes as character flaws rather than as the inevitable cost of attempting anything difficult. Each of these sources installs a specific response to defeat: shame. And shame is the enemy of learning. The ashamed mind does not examine, it conceals. The ashamed mind does not investigate, it explains away. The ashamed mind does not ask what can be learned, it asks how the failure can be hidden or forgotten. Shame transforms defeat from potential education into actual damage. What then must be unlearned? First and most important, the automatic association between failure and inadequacy. When defeat triggers shame, this response must be consciously interrupted and replaced with curiosity. The question must shift from, "What does this say about me?" to "What does this reveal about reality?" This single substitution, practiced consistently over time, begins to rewire the trained response. Second, we must unlearn the instinct to move on. Well-meaning advice to put failure behind us is often the worst possible counsel. Moving on without extracting the lessons ensures that we shall repeat the failure, perhaps in larger and more costly form. The goal is not to dwell morbidly on defeat, but to investigate it thoroughly before releasing it. There is a great difference between unhealthy dwelling and productive investigation. Third, we must unlearn the habit of explanation that serves ego rather than understanding. When we fail, the mind naturally generates explanations. Circumstances were unfavorable, others did not perform their duties, timing was unfortunate. Some of these explanations may contain truth, but the crucial question is whether our explanations serve understanding or self-protection. The test is simple. Does your explanation of a failure cast you in a favorable light? If so, it is almost certainly incomplete. I propose a practice for the reader who recognizes this training in themselves. The next time you experience failure, whether a rejected proposal, a lost opportunity, or a public mistake, observe your immediate emotional response. Notice the shame, the desire to hide, the urge to explain or justify. Then, deliberately, shift into investigation. Take paper and write, what actually happened? What did I not know that I needed to know? What did I assume that proved false? What will I do differently? This mechanical process, performed even when emotions resist, begins to overwrite the trained response of shame with the productive response of analysis. It will feel unnatural at first. Decades of contrary training cannot be undone in an afternoon. But with consistent practice, the new response becomes habitual, and defeat transforms from wound to education. The education that crippled you was not your fault. You received it before you could evaluate it. But continuing to operate under its influence is a choice. The training can be reversed. The shame response can be replaced. And when it is, defeat ceases to damage and begins to develop. This reversal is not comfortable, but it is essential, for without it, every failure confirms a lie, and every success remains fragile, vulnerable to the first catastrophe that penetrates our defenses. Here is a truth that will seem paradoxical until you have fully grasped it. The man who has never been defeated is not fortunate but impoverished. He has constructed his life to avoid all significant achievement. He has purchased safety at the price of everything that makes safety worth having. He inhabits a prison of his own construction, though its walls are invisible and its bars are made of fear. I knew a man of considerable gifts who spent 40 years in a position far beneath his capabilities. He possessed intelligence that would have distinguished him in any field, energy sufficient for the most demanding enterprises, and connections that would have opened doors others could not approach. Yet he remained decade after decade in comfortable mediocrity. The reason became clear to me only gradually. In his youth he had experienced a painful professional setback, nothing catastrophic, merely embarrassing, a venture that failed publicly, colleagues who had witnessed his humiliation, the ordinary disaster that attends any serious attempt at achievement. From that moment, he arranged his entire life to ensure he would never again be so exposed. He succeeded perfectly. He was never again defeated, because he never again attempted anything that might defeat him. He chose positions where success was guaranteed, tasks where failure was impossible, ventures where the outcome was certain before he began. At his retirement dinner, I watched his face as colleagues praised his steady career, his reliable performance, his consistent contribution. And I saw that he knew, had perhaps always known, that he had traded his potential for safety. This man's prison had no visible walls. He could come and go as he pleased. He was not constrained by circumstance or oppressed by authority. His prison was constructed entirely of fear, fear of the defeat he had once experienced and resolved never to experience again. And because fear is invisible, he could pretend, even to himself, that he was free. I put to you that this prison is more common than we acknowledge. How many men and women of genuine capability spend their years in tepid safety, never venturing what they might lose, and therefore never gaining what they might win? How many brilliant minds remain in positions that do not challenge them, performing tasks that do not stretch them, avoiding the only ventures that might reveal what they are capable of? The fear of defeat constrains far more lives than actual defeat ever destroys. I propose a test that will reveal whether you inhabit this prison. Examine your current life and identify every choice made primarily to avoid the possibility of failure. Not choices made because the odds were genuinely unfavorable. Wisdom dictates avoiding foolish risks, but choices made because you could not tolerate the possibility of defeat regardless of odds. Count them honestly. If the number is high, you may be imprisoned without knowing it. There is a second test, perhaps more revealing. Notice the distance between what you are capable of and what you are currently attempting. If this gap is large, and the reason is fear of failure rather than genuine strategic consideration, you have diagnosed the prison walls. Consider the regret projection, which I have found useful in my own deliberations. Imagine yourself at the end of life, looking back. Will you regret the defeats you suffered or the risks you never took? I have observed that the old regret inaction far more than action. They do not lie awake mourning ventures that failed. They lie awake mourning ventures never attempted. The defeats we suffer fade in memory. The possibilities we refuse to pursue haunt us. What, then, shall we do? I do not advocate recklessness. The goal is not to eliminate prudence, but to distinguish prudence from cowardice. Some risks are genuinely unwise, and wisdom lies in recognizing them. But the test must be honest. Are you avoiding a venture because the odds are truly unfavorable, or because you cannot bear the thought of failing at something that matters to you? The former is wisdom, the latter is prison. I propose the following practice. Identify one meaningful risk you have been avoiding because you fear the possibility of failure. It need not be your largest avoided risk. Begin with something significant but not overwhelming. Write down precisely what you fear would happen if you attempted and failed. Examine each feared consequence. Is it realistic? Is it survivable? In most cases, honest examination reveals that even our worst fears are less catastrophic than we imagine. Then write down what you know will happen if you never attempt at all. This is not speculation. This is certainty. If you do not attempt, you will not achieve. If you do not risk, you will not gain. If you do not venture, you will remain exactly where you are, watching others attempt the things you were afraid to try. Compare the two outcomes honestly. In most cases, the certain cost of inaction exceeds the possible cost of failure. The prison extracts its price daily in opportunities not pursued and potential not realized. Defeat, should it come, is at least a single event from which recovery is possible. But the slow erosion of a life lived in fear permits no recovery, for there is no single moment of failure to point to, only the gradual diminishment of possibility. The undefeated man is not to be envied. He has purchased his perfect record at the price of everything worth doing. The prison of the undefeated is the most comfortable of prisons, for its inmate never feels the bars. He only feels in quiet moments the vague sense that life was meant to be more than this. That vague sense is the truth trying to reach him through walls of fear. Let us have the courage to hear it. When a man rides the crest of success, he is surrounded by a pleasant fog that obscures as much as it illuminates. Flatterers gather around him, each competing to tell him what he wishes to hear. His position, which is the product of particular circumstances and particular decisions, comes to seem like the natural order of things, as though the universe had arranged itself to place him exactly where he belongs. His opinions, which may be sound or unsound, are treated as wisdom simply because they proceed from a successful mouth. In this fog, a man cannot see himself clearly. He mistakes his position for proof of his judgment. He believes that the qualities which brought him thus far will carry him further still, when in truth those qualities may have exhausted their utility or may never have been the cause of his success at all. He cannot see his own limitations because everyone around him is conspiring, not from malice, but from interest, to hide them from him. Catastrophic defeat strips all of this away in an instant. The flatterers vanish like morning mist before the sun. The pleasant fog dissipates, and the defeated man sees with terrible clarity exactly where he stands. He discovers which of his friendships were founded upon genuine regard and which were merely the natural gravitation of lesser men toward power. He learns which of his cherished beliefs were true insights and which were merely comfortable assumptions that success had prevented him from examining. This clarity is painful. I shall not pretend otherwise. It is rather like having a brilliant light shone directly into one's eyes after years in dim rooms. Every flaw is illuminated. Every weakness is exposed. Every error of judgment that contributed to the catastrophe becomes visible in retrospect, and the defeated man must confront not only what happened, but his own role in making it happen. Yet this painful clarity is also invaluable. For the first time, perhaps in many years, the defeated man can see himself as he actually is, without the distortions that success inevitably produces. He can assess his true capabilities, stripped of the inflation that position and power provide. He can identify the specific errors, nor merely of tactic but of character, that created the conditions for his fall. In my own wilderness years, when the corridors of power were closed to me, and former colleagues crossed the street to avoid conversation, I experienced this clarity with full force. I saw, for the first time, exactly where I had erred. The confidence that had seemed justified revealed itself as arrogance. The certainty that had felt like strength showed itself as rigidity. The assumptions I had never questioned exposed themselves as the very foundations of my fall. I do not say I was grateful for this education whilst receiving it. One is not grateful for the surgeon's knife whilst it cuts, but I recognized, even in the midst of pain, that I was seeing truths about myself that years of success had hidden from me. And I recognized that these truths, however uncomfortable, were precisely what I needed to see if I was ever to rise again. The practical question is how to capture this clarity before it fades, for defeat offers only a limited window of unusual vision. Before defenses reconstruct themselves, before rationalizations form, before the mind begins its natural work of self-protection, the defeated person can see truly. But this window closes. Within weeks or months, the comfortable fog begins to return, and the opportunity for genuine self-knowledge passes. I counseled this. Within the first days after catastrophe, whilst the pain is sharp and the defenses not yet rebuilt, take paper and write down everything you can see that was invisible before, who has remained and who has departed. What assumptions proved false? What weaknesses of character created the conditions for failure? What would you do differently if you could begin again? This document, painful to produce, becomes invaluable guidance once the immediate crisis passes. It is a message from your clearer self to your foggier self, a record of truths that the rebuilding mind will be tempted to obscure. Guard it carefully and return to it often, for it contains knowledge that success could never have provided. There is a further gift within this clarity, and it concerns the sorting of relationships. In times of success, one cannot know which associations are founded upon genuine regard and which are founded upon calculation. Everyone appears loyal when loyalty costs nothing. Everyone appears devoted when devotion brings advantage. But defeat performs the sorting that prosperity conceals. Those who remain after catastrophe are your true connections. Those who depart were drawn to your position, not to your person. This knowledge, however painful to acquire, is immensely valuable. It tells you who can be trusted when trust matters most. It reveals the foundation of genuine relationship beneath the superstructure of social convenience. Defeat, then, is not merely something to be survived. It is an opportunity for vision that success never provides. The man who can receive this gift, who can endure the pain of clarity and extract its lessons, emerges with knowledge of himself and others that no amount of triumph could ever teach. This is the first gift of the forge, not comfort, but sight. Here is a paradox that contains tremendous power, and I ask you to hold it in your mind until its truth becomes apparent. The man who has lost everything is stronger than the man who fears losing what he has. This seems nonsense upon first hearing. How can loss produce strength? How can the stripped and fallen possess power that the secure and elevated lack? Yet I have observed this paradox confirmed so many times that I can no longer doubt it. Consider how most men are constrained not by their circumstances, but by their terror of descending from those circumstances. The successful merchant cannot speak truth to the powerful buyer because he fears losing the account. The rising politician cannot voice unpopular wisdom because he fears losing support. The comfortable professional cannot pursue the venture that calls to him because he fears losing his position. In each case, what constrains is not external force, but internal fear. Now consider the man who has already lost. The merchant whose business has collapsed has nothing more to fear from offending the powerful buyer. The politician who has been turned out of office has nothing more to lose from speaking unpopular truth. The professional who has been dismissed has no position left to protect. In each case, the catastrophe has eliminated the fear that constrained all action. I observed this truth most vividly in my own experience. During my years of prominence, I found myself tempering statements, moderating positions, calculating the effects of each word upon my standing. I did not lie, but neither did I speak with the fullness that truth deserved. The preservation of position required constant adjustment, constant accommodation, constant awareness of how each statement would be received by those whose favor I required. When I fell into the wilderness, something remarkable occurred. With nothing left to protect, I could finally say exactly what I saw. The warnings I issued about gathering dangers, warnings that conventional wisdom of the time dismissed as alarmist, were possible precisely because I had already lost what caution would have protected. I had no office to preserve, no coalition to maintain, no position to defend. The prisoner speaks truths that the comfortable man dare not whisper. This liberation is not merely rhetorical. It extends to action as well as speech. The man who has nothing to lose can attempt ventures that the man clinging to position would never risk. He can pursue strategies that might fail spectacularly because he has already failed spectacularly and survived. He can make decisions based purely on what is right and wise, rather than on what will protect what he has accumulated. I do not suggest that you should seek to lose everything in order to gain this freedom. That would be foolishness of a high order. What I suggest is that you can access much of this freedom without requiring actual catastrophe. The method is psychological rather than material. Begin by listing everything you fear losing: position, reputation, wealth, relationships, comfort. For each item, ask yourself honestly, would losing this actually destroy me? In most cases, careful examination reveals that even significant losses are survivable. You have survived difficulties before. You would survive them again. The fear of loss is almost always greater than the reality of loss. Next, imagine that you have already lost what you most fear losing. Sit with this reality until it becomes conceivable, even if uncomfortable. From this imagined position of loss, notice how your thinking changes. What would you do? What would you say? What would you attempt? The answers to these questions reveal what fear is currently preventing. Finally, ask yourself, what am I not doing because I fear losing something I possess? The answer exposes how much of your current constraint is self-imposed protection of position rather than genuine limitation. In most cases, honest examination reveals that you are trading significant possibilities for the maintenance of things that matter less than you pretend. There is a caution here that must be stated clearly. This teaching can be perverted into recklessness. The point is not to throw away what you have for the experience of having nothing. The point is to free yourself from the tyranny of protection so that you can act wisely rather than fearfully. There is a great difference between the freedom of the man who has lost everything and the foolishness of the man who destroys everything to feel free. The goal is not actual loss, but freedom from the fear of loss. And this freedom can be achieved through imagination and psychological preparation rather than through actual catastrophe. You need not wait until you have fallen to access the clarity and courage that the fallen possess. You can touch that liberation while still possessing what you have by recognizing that you could survive its loss and that its protection is not worth the paralysis it imposes. When you truly understand that you can survive what you fear, that fear loses its power to constrain you. And when fear loses its power, you can act on what you know to be right and wise, rather than on what will preserve your position. This is the second gift of the Forge, not comfort, but freedom. The philosophers of antiquity understood a truth that our modern comfort seekers have labored mightily to forget. The soul is forged in fire. They knew, those ancient thinkers who laid the foundations upon which all subsequent wisdom has been built, that ease is the enemy of excellence, that struggle is not the price we pay for achievement, but the very means by which achievement becomes possible. When we grasp that our worst defeats are our greatest weapons, we are not discovering something new. We are merely rediscovering what the wise have always known. Consider the nature of the human body, and you will find a principle that applies equally to the human spirit. Muscles that are never challenged do not merely remain static. They wither into uselessness. The arm that lifts no weight loses the capacity to lift weight. The leg that walks no distance loses the capacity to walk distance. We are designed in our very physical constitution to require resistance. Without it, we decay. So too with the faculties of mind and character. The judgment that is never tested against difficulty remains weak. The courage that is never called upon atrophies into mere sentiment. The resilience that never encounters opposition dissolves into softness. We require obstacles not despite our nature, but because of it. We are built for the conversion of resistance into strength. This is not metaphor, but observation. I have witnessed across a long life the unmistakable pattern. Those who encountered serious opposition developed capacities impossible to those who did not. The officers who had known defeat in battle understood warfare at a depth unavailable to officers who had known only victory. The statesmen who had been turned out of office comprehended politics with a completeness that the perpetually successful could not approach. The entrepreneurs who had built, lost, and rebuilt possessed a quality entirely absent from those who had only built. Defeat, then, is not a malfunction of the universe. It is not evidence that something has gone wrong with the natural order. It is the mechanism by which we become what we are capable of becoming. Those who are never defeated, if such unfortunate souls exist, are thereby prevented from developing the very qualities that would make their success meaningful. I have observed in my own life that the periods of struggle produced growth whilst the periods of ease produced decay. The years that seemed most fortunate at the time, years of unbroken advancement, of success following success, often proved most barren in retrospect. I coasted. I did not develop. I repeated what had worked before, without questioning whether it would work again. The years of hardship resented whilst endured produced the capacities that made everything else possible. This understanding has implications for how we live, not merely for how we respond to catastrophe. If resistance is essential to development, then the deliberate maintenance of appropriate challenge throughout life becomes not masochism but wisdom. The man who arranges his existence to eliminate all difficulty is not caring for himself, he is starving himself. I propose what I shall call the comfort suspicion. Learn to view extended periods of ease with wariness rather than gratitude. If nothing is challenging you, nothing is developing you. If you have arranged your affairs so that every day proceeds without significant difficulty, you have arranged your own stagnation. The comfortable man is the decaying man, however pleasant his decay may feel. Examine your current life for areas of excessive comfort, domains where you have successfully eliminated all serious challenge. In your profession, have you retreated to tasks you can perform without effort, positions where nothing tests your capacities? In your physical life, have you arranged comfortable routine where no exertion is required? In your intellectual life, do you engage only with ideas you already accept, opinions that confirm what you already believe? For each area of excessive ease, consider introducing deliberate, appropriate resistance, not artificial hardship for its own sake. There is no virtue in suffering that produces nothing, but genuine engagement with difficulty that will produce growth. The discomfort you create is not punishment but cultivation. It is the soil from which capacity grows. A caution must be stated clearly. This teaching does not mean that all difficulty is productive or that suffering should be sought indiscriminately. The art is distinguishing between challenge that develops and adversity that merely damages. Not all struggle strengthens, some merely harms. The goal is growth, not martyrdom. How, then, do we distinguish productive resistance from destructive hardship? The test is whether the struggle calls forth capacities that exist within us but have not yet been developed. Productive challenge stretches, destructive hardship crushes. Productive challenge leaves us stronger when it passes. Destructive hardship leaves us merely damaged. Productive challenge, however difficult in the moment, produces something of value. Destructive hardship produces only loss. The soul is designed for struggle, as the body is designed for movement. Deny it the resistance it requires, and it withers. Provide it appropriate challenge, and it develops capacities that ease could never produce. This is not theory, but the observable pattern of human development across all domains and all ages. We are forged in fire, or we are not forged at all. The journey from catastrophe to weapon proceeds through distinct stations, each of which must be navigated before the next becomes accessible. The first station, and the place where most defeated souls become permanently trapped, is acceptance. Not the weak acceptance that mouths words whilst the heart denies them, but the unflinching acceptance that looks directly at defeat without explaining, justifying, or deflecting. True acceptance means saying, "I failed," not "I was failed," which shifts responsibility outward. Not "circumstances conspired against me," which transforms personal failure into cosmic injustice. Not "if only things had been different," which retreats into fantasy. But simply, starkly, irrevocably, "I failed. This is mine. This failure belongs to me, and I shall not pretend otherwise." This sounds simple. It is anything but. The human mind possesses extraordinary capacity for constructing alternative narratives in which failure becomes something other than failure. I have watched intelligent men spend years, decades in some cases, building elaborate explanations for catastrophes that a moment's honest reflection would have revealed as their own doing. One colleague, after a disastrous venture, developed an intricate theory of betrayal and circumstance that absolved him entirely. The partners who had failed to perform their duties, the timing that could not have been foreseen, the external forces that no prudent man could have anticipated. He told this story so often and so convincingly that I believe he came to accept it himself. 20 years later, he made precisely the same errors in precisely the same way, because he had never truly accepted that the first failure was his to own and learn from. Why is acceptance so difficult? Because it requires a particular form of courage that is perhaps the rarest of all, the courage to be humiliated before one's own internal tribunal. We can endure public embarrassment. We can survive the criticism of others. We can weather external storms with remarkable fortitude. But to stand before ourselves and say, "I failed, and the failure was my own," this requires confronting an image of ourselves that we have spent years constructing and protecting. The signs of false acceptance are easy to identify once you know to look for them. When your explanation of a failure casts you in a favorable light, you have not yet accepted. When the narrative you tell places responsibility primarily on external factors, you have not yet accepted. When you find yourself constructing ever more elaborate accounts of what went wrong, accounts that grow more detailed and more self-serving with each retelling, you have not yet accepted. The test is simple and brutal. Can you state your failure in a single sentence that contains no external attribution? Can you say, "I failed at this because of this flaw in my judgment or character"? If the sentence requires qualification, exception, or context before it can be spoken, acceptance remains incomplete. I propose a practice for those who recognize themselves trapped before the first station. Select a significant defeat from your past, one that still carries emotional weight. Write down your current account of what happened. Examine this account with clinical detachment. Where do you attribute failure to circumstance? Where do you invoke the failings of others? Where do you appeal to forces beyond your control? For each external factor, ask a simple question. What could I have done differently that might have changed this outcome? In some cases, the honest answer may be nothing. There are genuine catastrophes that no prudence could have prevented. But in most cases, honest examination reveals choices you made, assumptions you held, actions you took or failed to take that contributed to the result. Now write a new account that centers your own responsibility. I failed because I complete the sentence honestly, fully, without qualification. The discomfort you feel in writing this sentence is the sensation of approaching true acceptance. A warning must be given. Acceptance is not self-flagellation. There is a counterfeit acceptance that consists of theatrical guilt, public confession, excessive self-criticism, performances of acceptance that allow one to feel virtuous without actually accepting anything. The man who beats his breast and proclaims his unworthiness may be avoiding genuine acceptance as thoroughly as the man who constructs elaborate justifications. True acceptance is quiet. It does not require witnesses. It does not seek sympathy. It simply acknowledges what happened and who was responsible, then moves forward to the work of extraction and transformation. The first station is not a destination but a gateway. Pass through it honestly, and the remaining stations become accessible. Remain trapped before it, and no progress is possible. Without acceptance, there can be no inventory of what remains. Without acceptance, there can be no reinterpretation of what occurred. Without acceptance, there can be no forging of new capacity and no deployment of what has been forged. Everything depends on this first, difficult, essential station. Pass through it, and you have begun. Avoid it, and you remain forever at the beginning. Having passed through acceptance, the defeated soul arrives at the second station, inventory. Here the task is to survey with cold clarity exactly what has been lost and, crucially, exactly what remains. Most defeated persons fail this station by performing only half the required examination. They catalog their losses with obsessive detail whilst ignoring their remaining assets entirely. I observed this failure with particular clarity in an acquaintance who suffered a financial catastrophe, a man who lost essentially everything he had built over 2 decades. When I encountered him in the aftermath, he was spiraling into despair. He could enumerate his losses with perfect precision. The properties gone, the investments evaporated, the position forfeited, the reputation damaged. Over dinner, I pressed him to list what actually remained. He resisted at first. What could possibly remain after such devastation? But I persisted. He still possessed his mind, which was sharper than most. His health remained intact. 2 decades of knowledge about his trade, knowledge that no bankruptcy could erase, resided still within him. Several genuine friendships had survived the catastrophe. And he possessed something he had not had for years, the freedom to pursue ventures that his previous commitments had prevented him from considering. As he enumerated these assets, I watched his posture change. He had been so fixated on what was gone that he had not noticed what remained. Yet these remaining assets, capabilities, knowledge, relationships, and freedom constituted the raw material from which recovery would be built. I propose a systematic approach to inventory. Examine remaining assets across 5 categories. First, capabilities. What can you still do? The skills you have developed do not disappear with defeat. They remain available for deployment in new contexts. Second, knowledge. What do you know? Understanding accumulated over years of experience persists regardless of circumstance. Third, relationships. Who remains? Defeat performs a sorting of connections. Those who persist through catastrophe are genuine. Fourth, resources. What do you still possess, however modest? Fifth, intangibles. Health, time, the essential self that cannot be touched by external disaster. Force yourself to find at least 5 items in each category. The defeated mind naturally underestimates remaining assets. Discipline is required to counteract this tendency. What you discover may surprise you. Even catastrophic defeat rarely strips everything away. The inventory reveals the foundation upon which rebuilding becomes possible. Having completed inventory, the defeated person arrives at the third station, reinterpretation. Here the task is to transform the meaning of the defeat itself, to see it not merely as something that happened to you, but as something that was preparing you for what comes next. This is not the weak comfort of everything happens for a reason. That platitude avoids the work of genuine reinterpretation. Genuine reinterpretation involves specific, concrete answers to specific, concrete questions. What did this defeat teach you that nothing else could have taught? What weaknesses did it expose that you can now address? What false assumptions did it shatter that would otherwise have led to greater disasters? What fears has it eliminated by making their objects already real? Consider the warrior who survives a wound. The wound itself is damage, pure and simple. But the scar tissue that forms during healing is stronger than the original flesh. The warrior who has been wounded and healed possesses durability that the unwounded cannot match. The wound was not desirable, but its aftermath, properly processed, produces capacity that would not otherwise exist. So it is with defeat. The defeat itself was damage, but the processing of defeat, the lessons extracted, the assumptions corrected, the capacities developed in response, produces something that success could never have provided. The man who has been bankrupted and recovered understands finance at a depth impossible to those who have known only prosperity. The leader who has been abandoned by followers and gathered new ones comprehends loyalty at depths the perpetually followed cannot approach. The 4 questions of reinterpretation must be answered specifically, not vaguely. I learned about myself is not an answer. I learned that I trust too quickly and must verify before committing is an answer. It made me stronger is not an answer. It eliminated my fear of public failure because I have now survived public failure is an answer. Specificity is the mark of genuine reinterpretation. Vagueness is the mark of avoidance. A caution must be stated. Reinterpretation cannot be rushed. Attempting to find meaning in defeat before accepting it fully produces false consolation rather than genuine understanding. Attempting to extract lessons before inventorying what remains produces incomplete analysis. The stations must be navigated in order. Attempts to skip ahead merely delay genuine progress. When inventory and reinterpretation are complete, the defeated person possesses the raw materials and the understanding necessary for the work that follows. They know what remains. They know what the defeat has taught. They are prepared to forge from these elements the weapon that only catastrophe could have placed in their hands. The 4th station is where raw material becomes weapon. Having accepted defeat, inventoried remaining assets, and reinterpreted the catastrophe's meaning, the defeated person now possesses everything necessary for the work of forging. This station combines the lessons extracted from defeat with the assets that remain, creating from this unlikely combination a capacity for action that did not exist before. Consider what defeat uniquely provides. The man who has been publicly humiliated and survived now possesses immunity to the fear of humiliation that paralyzes others. This immunity is not philosophical understanding. It is lived experience. He has been through the fire and emerged. He knows in his bones that the fire does not destroy. This knowledge is a weapon that no amount of success could ever have forged. The woman who has lost her fortune and rebuilt understands commerce at a depth that comfortable prosperity could never teach. She has seen how quickly the substantial can become insubstantial. She knows which elements of business genuinely matter and which are merely the pleasant accessories of success. This knowledge allows her to act with a decisiveness and clarity impossible to those who have never been tested. The leader who has been abandoned by followers and then gathered new ones knows truths about loyalty and authority that the perpetually supported cannot fathom. He understands what binds people to a cause and what merely attaches them to advantage. He can distinguish genuine devotion from convenient alignment. This discernment is a weapon forged only in the fires of abandonment and recovery. I shall paint two portraits to illustrate the forging station. The first, a military officer whose disastrous campaign cost brave men their lives. He studies his failure with the detachment of a surgeon examining a wound. He identifies precisely where judgment erred and why. He traces tactical mistakes to their roots in character, the overconfidence that prevented him from hearing warnings, the rigidity that kept him committed to a plan that circumstances had rendered obsolete. From this analysis, he forges new capacities. He develops an instinct for the false confidence that precedes disaster. He can recognize it now because he has experienced it. He cultivates the flexibility he previously lacked. He learns to listen to subordinates whose observations might save his next campaign. His worst defeat becomes the foundation of his subsequent effectiveness. His commands bear the mark of education that only failure could provide. The second portrait, an identical officer, identical failure, who does not pass through the stations. He constructs justifications. He blames faulty intelligence, unreliable subordinates, impossible orders from above. He becomes either paralyzed by caution, so terrified of repeating his mistake that he cannot make any decision that carries risk, or reckless in compensation, attempting through bravado to prove that he is not what his defeat suggests. Either way, he is controlled by his defeat rather than controlling it. No weapon is forged, only damage remains. The difference between these officers is not native ability, both possess talent. The difference is whether the raw material of defeat was forged into weapon or left as wreckage. The fire either tempers the steel or destroys it. The outcome depends entirely on how the fire is received. The fifth and final station is deployment. The weapon has been forged. Now it must be wielded. This station involves identifying the aims that defeat has clarified and directing the newly forged capacity toward their achievement. For catastrophic failure provides another gift beyond the weapon itself. It strips away frivolous objectives and reveals what truly matters. Before defeat, a man may pursue 100 objectives, some worthy, some merely convenient, some imposed by expectation rather than chosen from conviction. Defeat burns away this confusion. What remains after the fire reveals what was genuine. The defeated man, forced to rebuild from foundations, chooses with far greater wisdom what he shall rebuild toward. I counsel progressive deployment. Begin wielding your forged weapon in smaller contexts before committing to major ventures. Test its edge. Discover its properties. Build confidence through demonstrated effectiveness rather than assumed capacity. The weapon is real, but your skill in using it must be developed through practice. The most common error at this station is failing to deploy at all. Some become so absorbed in the process of forging that they never actually use what they have created. The weapon exists to be wielded. The capacities developed through defeat are meant to serve purposes in the world, not to be admired as achievements in themselves. When forging is complete, deployment must follow, or all the work of transformation produces nothing of value. The principles we have explored apply with particular force to the arena of love and relationship. Here the stakes are highest and the resistance to understanding is greatest. Here men and women construct elaborate defenses against the very vulnerability that depth requires, and here, perhaps more than in any other domain, Defeat can be transmuted into a capacity for connection that the undefeated can never possess. Consider the fundamental requirement of genuine relationship: vulnerability. To love is to risk rejection. To trust is to risk betrayal. To commit is to risk failure. There is no path to depth that does not pass through the possibility of defeat. The walls we construct to protect ourselves from heartbreak are the same walls that prevent genuine intimacy from reaching us. I have observed a marriage that weathered betrayal, a breach so severe that most would have counseled its termination. The injury was real. I do not minimize it. Yet the couple chose a different path. Rather than retreating into protected isolation or dissolving the union entirely, they descended into the catastrophe together. They examined what had led to the betrayal, what weaknesses in their connection had created the conditions for it, what each had contributed to the vulnerability that was exploited. This examination was painful. It required both parties to accept their portion of responsibility, not for the act of betrayal itself, which belonged to the one who committed it, but for the state of the marriage that had made such an act conceivable. From this acceptance, they rebuilt upon foundations they could never have laid without the destruction. 10 years later, their union possessed a quality I have rarely witnessed, a depth born of having lost everything and chosen to rebuild. They understood each other with an intimacy impossible to those who had never been forced to examine their connection so thoroughly. They had passed through fire together and emerged fused in a way that comfortable relationships never achieve. Beside them, marriages that had never known crisis seemed somehow less substantial, not because conflict is desirable, but because the survival of conflict creates something unavailable to the perpetually smooth. The spouse who has endured and repaired a rupture understands marriage at depths that those in frictionless unions cannot approach. This principle extends beyond marriage to all forms of relationship. The friendship that has survived disagreement possesses a quality absent from friendships where disagreement has been carefully avoided. The family that has weathered crisis and emerged intact understands its bonds differently from families that have never been tested. I put to you a challenging proposition. Your previous relational defeats, the rejections, the betrayals, the failures of connection, have taught you things about yourself and others that success in love could never teach. The heartbreak you suffered was genuine damage at the time. But the processing of that heartbreak, if properly undertaken, produces understanding that serves every subsequent relationship. What do we learn from relational defeat? We learn what we actually require, as distinguished from what we thought we required. We learn how our own patterns contribute to failures of connection. We learn to distinguish genuine compatibility from the intoxication of early attraction. We learn what we are willing to accept and what we are not. These lessons, extracted from painful experience, constitute wisdom that the relationally undefeated cannot possess. I propose an examination for those who have built protective walls around their hearts. Identify where you have constructed defenses in your relationships, places where you refuse vulnerability because you fear being hurt. For each wall, ask, what intimacy is this protection preventing? What depth am I sacrificing for safety? The answers may reveal that you are trading the possibility of genuine connection for the illusion of security. A caution must be stated with particular force in this domain. This teaching must not be perverted into tolerance for abuse. There is a vast difference between the vulnerability that creates depth and the submission that enables destruction. Some relationships should end. Some protections are warranted. The point is not that all relational defeat should be endured, but that fear of relational defeat should not prevent genuine connection. The invulnerable heart is the isolated heart. Those who protect themselves completely from the possibility of heartbreak protect themselves equally from the possibility of genuine love. This is the trade we must understand clearly. Safety from defeat means safety from depth. We cannot have one without risking the other. Choose which you prefer, but choose honestly, and understand that the capacity for deep connection is forged, like every other valuable capacity, in the fires of defeat survived and transmuted. What applies to the individual soul applies with equal force to the collective bodies through which humanity organizes itself. The family, the institution, the nation. I have observed across the span of a life lived largely in public service that the same principles governing personal transformation govern the fate of peoples. A society that shields its members from all possibility of defeat is not protecting them, but starving them. An education that prevents failure prevents the only learning that truly transforms. Civilizations have crumbled not because they lost battles, but because they lost their capacity to be defeated and rise again. Consider the matter of nations. Within living memory, I have witnessed peoples face catastrophic military defeat, the kind of devastation that might reasonably be expected to end a nation's story forever. Yet the outcome has varied remarkably between those who processed their disaster through genuine acceptance and those who constructed elaborate explanations to avoid the lessons on offer. One nation I observed accepted responsibility with unflinching honesty. It inventoried what remained, not inconsiderable, for even catastrophe rarely strips everything away. It reinterpreted the experience as foundation rather than verdict, asking not, "Why has fate cursed us?" but "What must we become?" From the lessons learned, it forged new capacities and deployed these in service of clarified national purpose. Within a generation, it emerged stronger than before its defeat. The catastrophe had become the crucible. Another nation, facing similar devastation, chose differently. It constructed elaborate explanations, blamed external factors, refused genuine acceptance. The stab-in-the-back mythology, the betrayal narratives, the conviction that others had stolen what was rightfully theirs, these became the national story. And that nation found itself repeating patterns that led to subsequent disasters, each worse than the last, until the landscape of Europe itself lay in ruins. The difference was not in the severity of the original defeats, but in how they were received and processed. But let us descend from the grand scale of nations to the intimate realm of family, where the same principles operate with perhaps even greater consequence. I have known parents who, moved by the most natural of instincts, sought to prevent their children from ever experiencing failure. Every obstacle was removed before the child could encounter it. Every competition was arranged so the child could not lose. Every difficulty was smoothed away by anxious parental intervention. The protective instinct is ancient and honorable. Yet what did these parents produce? They produced fragile adults incapable of weathering the storms that life inevitably brings, and life always brings them regardless of parental planning. The first employer who criticized their work shattered them. The first romantic rejection destroyed them. The first professional setback left them paralyzed. These unfortunate souls had been denied the very education that would have made them strong. Allow age-appropriate defeat. I would counsel any parent, teach processing rather than prevention. The same truth applies to institutions. In my long experience of organizations, military, governmental, commercial, I have observed that those which study and remember their failures outperform those that bury them. The regiment that conducts honest post-battle analysis, extracting lessons without descending into blame, becomes formidable. The government department that examines its policy failures, understanding what assumptions proved false, improves its subsequent performance. The commercial enterprise that investigates why its ventures failed, rather than dismissing the question with changes of personnel, builds wisdom that compounds over time. What is required is not blame-finding, but genuine extraction of lessons. There is a profound difference between the two, though they are often confused. Blame-finding asks, "Whose fault was this?" It seeks a culprit to punish. The question answered, the matter is considered closed. but nothing has been learned except who shall carry the shame. Lesson extraction asks different questions. What did we not know that we needed to know? What did we assume that proved false? What will we do differently? The questions answered. Wisdom has been gained that prevents repetition. Nations that have known defeat and processed it properly possess a resilience impossible to nations that have known only ease. The soft empire, never challenged, crumbles at the first serious pressure. We witnessed this truth repeatedly across the centuries, how quickly the comfortable fall, how stubbornly the hardened endure. The capacity to absorb defeat and transform it is a national characteristic that must be cultivated. Extended periods of ease for families, organizations, or nations should be viewed with suspicion rather than celebrated as achievement. If nothing is challenging the collective, nothing is developing it. The comfortable decay is a greater danger than the difficult growth. I have seen empires that seemed invincible in their prosperity, yet possessed, beneath the glittering surface, a fatal softness that would reveal itself at the first serious test. In whatever collective entities you influence, your family, your team, your organization, examine the relationship with failure. Is defeat something to be prevented at all costs, or understood as opportunity for development? Do you conduct post-failure analysis that genuinely extracts lessons, or do you engage in blame-finding that prevents learning? The answer to these questions determines whether your collective will strengthen through adversity or shatter upon first contact with serious difficulty. There is a danger at the collective level that must be named: the creation of cultures of failure, environments where defeat is so normalized that excellence ceases to be expected. The goal is not to celebrate failure, but to process it productively. There is a vast difference between an organization that learns from mistakes and one that tolerates mediocrity. Distinguish carefully between these, for the confusion leads to ruin either way, whether through brittleness that prevents any learning or through softness that excuses any performance. The principles of weaponized defeat apply beyond individual experience to every collective in which we participate. How the family handles setbacks determines whether children emerge resilient or fragile. How the institution processes failure determines whether it grows wise or repeats its errors. How the nation receives defeat determines whether it rises stronger or spirals toward destruction. And so the wisdom spreads outward like ripples in water, from the individual soul to the family hearth, from the family to the institution, from the institution to the nation itself. The same forge, the same fire, the same transformation, operating at every level of human organization. The deepest application of all we have explored is not episodic, but continuous. It is not merely a method for recovering from occasional catastrophes, but a complete reorientation of how one moves through existence. The man who has truly grasped this wisdom does not simply apply these principles when defeat occurs. He seeks appropriate resistance continuously, understanding that growth requires opposition, the way fire requires oxygen. He has shifted from avoiding difficulty to engaging it deliberately, from merely surviving struggle to seeking it intentionally. I have known men who, having survived great catastrophes and extracted their lessons, then arranged their subsequent lives to avoid all further challenge. They survived defeat, but did not learn its continuous teaching. Having weathered the storm, they retreated to harbor and resolved never to venture forth again. In doing so, they preserved what remained but ceased to grow. They became monuments to their past survival rather than living beings still developing. By contrast, I have known others who, having understood what struggle provides, deliberately maintained challenge in their lives even when they could have retired into ease. These latter aged with a vitality absent from their comfortable contemporaries. At 70, they possessed the energy of men half their age. At 80, they remained engaged with the difficulties of their time. They understood that resistance is not merely to be survived but to be sought, not because suffering is desirable, but because the capacities it develops are essential to a life worth living. After achieving goals, the wise man immediately establishes new challenges. The worst thing that can happen to a person is to run out of worthy difficulties. I observed this truth in my own life repeatedly. The periods of greatest danger were not those of greatest difficulty, but those of greatest ease. When the struggle was intense, I was alive to my fingertips. When the struggle ceased, when I was cast into the wilderness, when I was removed from the great decisions, depression descended like fog upon moorland. Not the black dog of mere melancholy, but the gray emptiness of purposelessness. Maintain continuous, appropriate resistance throughout life. This is the counsel of experience. Each day offers small resistances, frustrations, setbacks, obstacles of various kinds. The untrained mind receives these as annoyances to be endured. The trained mind receives them as micro-opportunities for the same conversion process that applies to catastrophic defeat. The habit built in small things prepares one for the large tests when they inevitably arrive. Think of it this way: the morning's frustrated plan, the afternoon's difficult colleague, the evening's domestic complication. Each is a small weight in the gymnasium of the soul. No single weight transforms. Consistent training transforms. The man who has practiced converting small resistances to strength will find, when great resistance arrives, that the movement is familiar. The woman who has fled every small difficulty will discover, when great difficulty comes, that she possesses no practiced response. Those who retire from challenge age rapidly. Those who maintain it remain vital. I have observed this with the certainty of one who has witnessed many men in their final decades. Plan not for the cessation of difficulty, but for its appropriate continuation. The goal of a well-lived life is not to reach a point where nothing is hard. Such a point, if reached, marks the beginning of decay. There is a shift that occurs in the master, a movement from passively enduring necessary struggle to actively seeking appropriate challenge. This shift transforms the experience of difficulty from burden to purpose. Where once you asked, "Why must I bear this?" you now ask, "What will this develop?" Where once resistance was enemy, it becomes ally. The relationship with difficulty itself changes fundamentally. Audit your current life for areas where you have successfully eliminated difficulty. In your profession, have you achieved a plateau where nothing challenges you? In your physical life, have you arranged comfortable routine unthreatened by demand? In your intellectual life, do you engage only with ideas you already accept? For each area of excessive ease, consider the introduction of deliberate, appropriate challenge. Not artificial hardship for its own sake. That would be mere performance, but genuine engagement with difficulty that will produce growth. The discomfort you create through such engagement is the soil from which capacity grows. The muscle that is never loaded never strengthens. The mind that is never challenged never sharpens. The character that is never tested never develops. These are not metaphors, but descriptions of how human beings are constituted. An error to avoid in this continuous practice is confusing any difficulty with productive difficulty. Not all struggle develops, some merely damages. The art lies in distinguishing between the challenge that creates growth and the adversity that merely harms. Seek the former, do not manufacture the latter. There is no virtue in hardship that serves no developmental purpose. Equally, avoid the performative hardship that some adopt to feel virtuous, difficulty for display rather than development. I have known men who undertook elaborate challenges primarily so they might speak of having undertaken them. Their struggles, though real enough, produced little growth because the purpose was external validation rather than internal transformation. The soul is not fooled by such performances. The shift I describe, from viewing this wisdom as crisis intervention to understanding it as life orientation, is perhaps the most important transition in the entire journey we have taken together through these pages. You are no longer merely equipped to survive occasional catastrophe. You are equipped to engage with resistance continuously, converting the daily difficulties of existence into the very material of your development. Seek appropriate resistance. Convert it to strength. Repeat until the final breath. This is the formula for a life that compounds rather than depletes, that grows rather than merely endures. It is within your reach from this moment forward. Those who have truly mastered the weaponization of defeat no longer fear catastrophe at all. This is not bravado. It is not the suppression of fear beneath a mask of courage. It is genuine transformation, the actual dissolution of the terror that grips most souls when they contemplate possible failure. The master approaches risk differently because he knows, with the certainty of lived experience repeatedly confirmed, that whatever befalls him can be transmuted. The worst has happened, perhaps more than once, and each time he has forged it into something useful. Knowing this, why should he fear? This fearlessness is itself transformative of one's capacity for action. Where others hesitate, paralyzed by potential consequences, the master moves freely. Not recklessly, the master still calculates odds and chooses wisely. But without the contaminating influence of fear that distorts most people's decisions. Fear is a kind of fog that obscures clear vision. Remove the fog, and options become visible that were hidden before. Paths open that seemed blocked. Possibilities emerge that fear had concealed. There came a time in my own life when I realized that the prospect of defeat no longer frightened me as it once had. This was not because I had become indifferent to outcomes. I cared as much as ever about the ventures I undertook, perhaps more. It was because I had proven to myself, through repeated experience, that I could transmute whatever occurred. The demonstrations had accumulated. The evidence was beyond dispute. The worst had happened to me more than once. Political exile when I believed myself essential. Public humiliation when I had been confident of triumph. Professional disasters that seemed, in the moment, to end everything worth caring about. And each time I had found within myself, or perhaps developed through necessity, the capacity to forge the catastrophe into weapon. Knowing this capacity existed, tested, and proven, I could engage with challenges that would have paralyzed my younger self. The fear had not been suppressed. It had been genuinely dissolved through demonstrated capacity to survive and convert. There is a crucial distinction here that must not be missed. The man who suppresses fear is like a man who holds a heavy weight at arm's length. The effort is constant, exhausting, and eventually the weight will fall. The man whose fear has dissolved has set down the weight entirely. He no longer carries it because it no longer exists. True fearlessness comes not from belief, but from proof. Each defeat successfully transmuted becomes evidence that future defeats can be similarly handled. You must accumulate this proof deliberately, through engagement with difficulty, and reference it when fear attempts to reassert itself. I have survived this before, you tell yourself, and the fear recedes because the statement is demonstrably true. The decision clarity that emerges from fearlessness is remarkable. Fear distorts decision-making in ways we rarely appreciate whilst in its grip. It amplifies certain outcomes and obscures others. It shortens time horizons. It narrows the range of options considered. When fear dissolves, you see choices more clearly and choose more wisely. The freedom from fear is not merely emotional relief. It is cognitive improvement of the most practical kind. Fearlessness develops progressively, not all at once. Each category of defeat successfully processed removes one type of fear. Having been publicly humiliated and survived, you no longer fear public humiliation. That particular terror has lost its power. Having lost your position and rebuilt, you no longer fear loss of position. Having been rejected in love and recovered, You no longer fear rejection with the same paralyzing intensity. Keep track of which fears remain and deliberately engage the experiences that will dissolve them. Identify your remaining fears, the potential defeats that still frighten you, that still have power to constrict your choices and narrow your ventures. For each, ask, have I ever survived something similar? Can I imagine transmuting this if it occurred? Where you have proof of survival, let that proof dissolve the fear. Where you lack proof, consider whether deliberately engaging a smaller version of this feared defeat might provide the evidence you need. The goal is not to seek catastrophe for the experience of surviving it. The goal is to accumulate the demonstrated capacity to survive and convert, thereby dissolving the fears that currently constrain you. There is a difference, one the master understands intuitively after enough practice. A danger to be named, confusing fearlessness with recklessness. The master does not ignore risk. The master evaluates it clearly, unclouded by the distortions that fear introduces. Wisdom remains essential. Calculation remains necessary. What changes is the emotional weather in which calculation occurs, not the requirement for calculation itself. Equally dangerous is performing fearlessness whilst fear remains operative beneath. Some men cultivate the appearance of courage whilst trembling internally. This performance eventually collapses under pressure, and the collapse is more damaging than honest fear would have been. True dissolution is quiet and complete. It does not require demonstration because it does not serve an audience. You now understand how fear can be dissolved rather than merely suppressed, and you possess a method for accomplishing this progressively. Identify which fears remain. Assess what proof would dissolve them. Determine how to acquire that proof safely. Then begin the accumulation. The freedom that awaits is worth whatever discomfort the process requires. The master becomes a teacher without intending to teach. This is one of the peculiar consequences of genuine transformation. It radiates outward, influencing those who witness it even when no instruction is offered. Others observe how the master handles adversity and find themselves educated by example. The embodied wisdom transmits itself through the simple fact of being observed. Words may follow, but they are secondary. The primary instruction is presence. People learn how to relate to defeat by watching those around them face it. This is true from earliest childhood and remains true throughout life. When they observe someone who is calm in catastrophe, converting adversity to asset, free from the fear that grips others, they receive an education deeper than any lecture could provide. Something shifts in their understanding of what is possible. If this person can face disaster with such composure, perhaps I too possess capacities I have not yet discovered. I recall a commander whose ship was struck by torpedo in waters far from home. The vessel was listing badly and would almost certainly be lost. What I remember most vividly was not the orders he gave, which were competent enough, the standard responses one would expect from a trained officer. What I remember was the quality of his presence as he gave them. His calm was not performance. It was genuine. One could see this immediately. The absence of fear in his voice, the steadiness of his gaze, the unhurried precision of his movements. His men, who might reasonably have panicked, instead moved with purposeful efficiency. They took their cues from him. Later, survivors spoke not of his words, but of how he stood, how he looked at them. The strange tranquility that seemed to surround him even as the ship groaned and listed beneath their feet. He taught them something in that hour that no training had conveyed. And those men, I subsequently observed, handled later disasters with similar composure. They had been taught by witness. The lesson had transferred without a word of instruction. This witness effect operates whether we intend it or not. Your handling of adversity teaches those around you how to handle theirs. Your children watch. Your colleagues observe. Your friends learn from your example. The question is not whether you are teaching, You are always teaching, but what curriculum you are delivering. When you face setback with panic, you teach panic. When you face it with despair, you teach despair. When you face it with the quiet competence of one who knows that all catastrophe can be transmuted, you teach that truth without uttering it. Performed composure teaches less than genuine composure. Others sense the difference with an accuracy that might surprise those attempting the performance. The tension beneath the mask communicates itself. The effort required to maintain appearances reveals itself in small ways. Only authentic transformation transmits the authentic lesson. You cannot teach what you have not become. The master's power comes from embodiment, not display. Sometimes the most powerful teaching is refusing to speak about difficulty, simply handling it and moving forward. This silence communicates that the difficulty was manageable, not worthy of elaborate discussion. It normalizes resilience by treating resilience as normal. The person who extensively discusses their hardships, however bravely borne, teaches that hardship is something requiring extensive discussion. The person who handles hardship and proceeds with their day teaches that hardship is simply part of the day. How you handle defeat teaches your children and their children. Your response to catastrophe becomes family legacy, transmitted across generations through the accumulated weight of witnessed example. Consider carefully what you are transmitting. The parent who collapses under pressure teaches their children that pressure causes collapse. The parent who transforms pressure into purposeful action teaches their children that pressure is material for transformation. Recognize that you are already teaching through your response to adversity. This teaching happens whether you acknowledge it or not. Ask yourself, what am I currently teaching? When I face setbacks, what do witnesses conclude about how such things should be handled? If your current teaching is not what you wish to transmit, the solution is not to perform differently, but to become different. Genuine development produces genuine transmission. Performance produces only the appearance of transmission. The temptation to perform for the benefit of observers must be resisted. To demonstrate calm rather than embody it is counterproductive. The performance itself teaches the wrong lesson. That composure is something one performs rather than possesses, something one displays rather than inhabits. Focus on genuine development. The transmission will follow naturally, without effort, without intention, simply through the fact of being observed. There is a teaching responsibility that comes with mastery, a responsibility you did not seek and cannot decline. Your handling of defeat instructs others whether you intend instruction or not. You can assess what you are currently transmitting and identify where development is needed. But this development should be sought not merely for your own sake, though that would be reason enough, but for the sake of those learning from your example. The young officer watches the senior officer face disaster. The child watches the parent receive bad news. The employee watches the employer navigate crisis. In each case, lessons are being transmitted. Let those lessons be worthy of the attention they inevitably receive. At the highest level of mastery, a remarkable transformation occurs. The very distinction between defeat and victory begins to dissolve. Every outcome becomes material for growth. The master no longer sorts experiences into successes and failures, but receives all of life as continuous education. This is not indifference to outcomes. The master still prefers success, still works toward desired ends with full commitment. But the relationship with outcome has so transformed that nothing can derail development. Whatever happens feeds the same process. I have lived long enough to watch many promising souls begin their journey. Most are stopped by their first serious defeat. They possessed ability, ambition, opportunity, everything required except the understanding that defeat could be transformed, rather than merely survived. When catastrophe arrived, they broke. The world never knew what they might have become. Their potential died with their hope, and they continued through their remaining years as shadows of what might have been. A precious few, discovered the secret I have endeavored to convey in these pages. For them, defeat was never final. For them, the worse the catastrophe, the more powerful the weapon it became when properly forged. They emerged from each disaster stronger than they entered it. Each failure taught them something that success could never have conveyed. Each humiliation stripped away some pretense that had been holding them back. They compounded over time whilst their equally talented but uninstructed peers depleted. I know which category I determined to fall into when the darkness closed around me. There were moments, I shall not pretend otherwise, when the easier path of surrender presented itself attractively. When the voice within whispered that perhaps this time the disaster was truly final, that nothing could be forged from wreckage so complete, the voice was wrong, as it always is. But its wrongness could only be proven through the decision to forge anyway, to treat the catastrophe as material regardless of how unpromising it appeared. And I tell you now, holding these final pages in your hands, that you face the same choice, not once, but continuously. Each new adversity presents the decision again. Will you be destroyed by this or forged by it? The question admits no middle ground. You cannot be slightly destroyed, partially forged. You choose one path or the other, and the choosing shapes everything that follows. At mastery, success and failure cease to be meaningful categories. Every experience becomes material. The promotion and the dismissal, the triumph and the humiliation, the love gained and the love lost, all feed the same furnace, all become fuel for the same transformation. Not as indifference to life's outcomes, that would be mere resignation, but as integration of all outcomes into a single process of development. The choice to be forged rather than destroyed is made not once, but renewed continuously. This is important to understand. You do not make the choice on some ceremonial occasion and then proceed automatically through subsequent adversities. Each new catastrophe, each fresh humiliation, each unexpected reversal presents the choice anew. Recognize this and choose deliberately each time. Do not assume that because you chose correctly yesterday, you will choose correctly today. The decision requires constant renewal. The time for this transformation is always now. Do not wait for the perfect moment or the correct circumstances. There will never be a time when you feel ready. There will never be a day when transformation becomes convenient. Whatever defeat you carry, whatever catastrophe you fear, whatever failure still weighs upon you, this is the material. This is the hour. Begin now or discover too late that you waited until beginning was no longer possible. The blade that has been properly forged, heated in the fire of catastrophe, hammered on the anvil of difficulty, tempered through repeated cycles of apparent destruction and renewal, cannot break. Not because it is rigid, rigidity breaks, but because it has learned to flex without shattering, to absorb tremendous force and return to true. Become this blade. Let the very disasters that would destroy ordinary metal become the tempering that makes you unbreakable. In this moment, recall your most significant unprocessed defeat, the catastrophe that still carries weight, still limits you, still defines in some dark corner of your mind what you believe yourself capable of. You are now equipped with everything needed to transmute it. The 5 stations await. The philosophy supports. The techniques are clear. What remains is choice. Will you be destroyed by this or forged by it? Make the choice consciously, explicitly. Speak it aloud if necessary. Let the decision be unmistakable. The final danger is reading these words, understanding them, agreeing with them, and then doing nothing. Understanding without action produces nothing. Philosophy without implementation is mere entertainment. The techniques described in these pages work only when applied. If you finish this book unchanged in practice, you have gained nothing but the pleasant sensation of agreeing with ideas. Choose action. Choose now. The man who has never been defeated is a man who has never been tested. He possesses no proven capacity because nothing has proven it. The man who has been defeated and destroyed is a tragedy, potential extinguished, capacity undeveloped, contribution unmade. But the man who has been defeated and has transformed that defeat into weapon, this is the man who will shape history, who will build enterprises that outlast him, who will love with a depth that the fortunate cannot fathom.